my chief operating officer, Jim, all of a sudden bursts into my office, red in the face, and he literally pounded my desk, and he demands to know why I always do that to this other leader on our team.
Hi, I'm Casey Jorgensen, host of The Manila Folder, a podcast about disruptive leadership, what it takes to be a disruptive leader, how to bounce back from failure, and how to shake up the status quo. Each week, I talk to founders, CEOs, executives, and experts about what it truly takes to succeed at the top. Hear about the mistakes they made and the lessons they learned along the way. Welcome to episode 1 of the Manila Folder podcast. The person you hear is Erica. She's one of the 70 million people in America who dread Monday mornings. Why? Because she hates her job. But more importantly, she doesn't like her boss. Tell me about your boss.
I had a boss who was very, very quick to judge.
Did you like him?
Not really.
The reason behind her and others' contempt is outlined each year in Gallup's annual study of employee engagement. This year, a whopping 70% of U.S. employees are disengaged, and global stats are even higher. Now, you may think it's a fluffy number, but at the end of the day, low employee engagement means low productivity, and that means bad news for businesses. The same study says U.S. companies are losing up to $500 billion each year in lost productivity. So how will this information help you to be a better leader? Well, to kick off the podcast, I decided to sit down with Dudley Slater, who has plenty of experience with employees and engagement. He's the co-founder and former CEO of Integra Telecom, a fiber-based network company that at its height grew to $600 million in revenue and over 2,000 employees. The company changed its name to Electric Lightwave in 2016 and was purchased earlier this year for $1.4 billion. Today, Dudley is a speaker and author who is starting a movement around employee engagement. He and Stephen Taylor co-authored Fusion Leadership, Unleashing the Movement of Monday Morning Enthusiasts, which launches September 12th. Dudley and I sat down to talk about his career, bad leadership moments, and what has him fired up about that Gallup study. So you went to Harvard Business School. Tell me about that.
You know, there's so many things said about the Harvard Business School, and I have to say I come down on the side of the believers. It's a fabulous program. I mean, number one, the faculty is the best in the world. So you have access to amazing thought leaders, terrific content. But I'm a real believer in the Socratic method, which is the case study method. And, the classes are interactive debates and discussions. And as we all eventually learn in the business world, there's often multiple pathways to get to an outcome. And it's not that one is right or wrong. It's kind of a question of what's the most effective to get things done. And that learning process is really what the Socratic method is about. And Harvard's better than anyone I've ever heard of or experienced. And it was a great learning for me. And, coming from a background with a technical degree, I also was very hungry to learn the basics of business, from accounting to marketing to organizational behavior and all those other wonderful topics. And Harvard does a great job.
You obviously learned a lot at Harvard, and 11 years later, you founded Integra. Can you tell us about the road that led you there?
Absolutely. Ultimately, it was a decision to get out on my own. What I was looking for at the time was the independence of not having a boss. Of course, at that time, I had no idea what types of pressures a young CEO finds him or herself under once you raise capital and you've all of a sudden got a bunch of investors who are not technically your boss, but they become very influential in your day. And, the journey, to go back to the beginning briefly, essentially my first time in my career, I was learning how an organization works. And, it took me a while to understand, how does the organization make money? How do you allocate responsibilities among an organization of people? How do you get things done? How do you set priorities? And I learned all that working for larger companies in my early career, initially as a geophysicist, and then later as a financial analyst, and growing into early stage management roles. But I ended up leaving, as I said, really to just get out on my own and have the independence of working for myself.
So you didn't leave because of a bad boss?
It's such a good question. I think probably what you say is fairly common, although in my case, it was different than that. And in my case, I was involved with the mergers and acquisitions activities of a publicly traded company in the old telephone industry, providing basic copper lines and dial tone services. And at that time, that was before the internet, so I'm dating myself. However, at that time, there was a lot of capital flowing into that space, and the company I worked for ended up finding itself somewhat constrained and unable to execute on some of the opportunities I saw. And so I ended up choosing to leave because I thought I would have a better chance to execute on these opportunities on my own than I would working for an organization that was saying no to some ideas that I thought were pretty good ideas. And, it wasn't because anybody there was necessarily a bad person. I just found that the opportunity I identified could be, in my opinion, better realized getting away from that organization, because they simply were somewhat capital constrained at the time. I'll tell you, the one thing I remember was, at that time, I was newly married, in my early 30s. We had our first child. I had a mortgage to pay. And I'll never forget the feeling after announcing I was quitting, because I didn't really have anything to go to. I was just going to go out on my own. And it was a funny feeling, because I packed up the things that were mine from my desk in my office, and I put them all in this box, and I got on the elevator, and I remember pushing the button to the parking garage, sitting there holding this box thinking, what have I done? Everything in my professional world fits in this box, and it's all really pretty worthless stuff, a couple business cards and a calculator, and there I was, leaving a well-paying job and heading out on my own. And it was pretty frightening, actually.
I'm actually pretty glad to hear that. I did something very similar. I stepped down from a well-paying executive role. I packed all of my things into a box, headed out the door, and I never looked back so I could start my own business.
That's really fun to hear. So you had the same elevator ride with the box in your arms, thinking that this is my entire professional life in this box?
Oh, yeah. And that song, All By Myself, that was playing in my head as I was walking away from the building, because I'm like, it's just me now.
That's such a great vision.
Yeah, it actually felt pretty cool. Okay, so you left your job and you founded Integra. At what point did growth kick in?
That was 1996. The growth really kicked in January of 2000. And we spent the intervening 3.5 years really figuring out the business model. And at that time, there were literally hundreds of new companies forming, all targeting this former monopoly space. And many of them were much better capitalized. They, just were very impressive new entrants into the market. And I did not want to be just another Me Too player. I really tried to answer the question, why will we be different? Why will somebody buy from us rather than, these other couple hundred competitors? And it took us 3 years to figure that out. And once we figured it out, we were able to go out and raise the capital. And the big event in January of 2000 was we raised $211 million of growth capital that would allow us to execute on our plan. And that allowed us to expand out of Portland, Oregon into 4 other states, mostly in the Northwest and Rocky Mountain. it was that growth capital that really launched us. But the short answer to your question is it took us 3 years to figure out our differentiation strategy. And then the pivotal event was raising the growth capital. And at that time, I brought in some well-known national private equity investors that were pretty deeply experienced in the telecom space. And that launched it.
Once Dudley brought on serious investors, things began to change at Integra. Investors, wanting to see their money used wisely, demanded more process and reporting. Growth meant hiring employees in order to scale and keep up with customer demand, and most of those 300 plus employees were distributed throughout the US. Now, during this time, they landed on the Fast 100 and Inc. 100 as one of the fastest growing companies in America. And eventually, they became one of the largest fiber-based network companies in the US. But this was all a far cry from the small office of 9 when Integra first began. And like most companies that experience hyper-growth, the culture began to change. And unfortunately, there were some missteps along the way.
Soon after we raised that big growth capital financing in 2001, I had these new investors showing up, and I was, of course, scheduling a lot of board meetings. And I remember after this one meeting, we had investors flying to Portland, Oregon from Boston and Dallas and New York, and we did the meeting. And as would be typical, they all rushed off to catch their flights back to their home cities. And my management team and I were kind of debriefing and feeling good about ourselves. And I went after the meeting. I went into my office by myself, and my chief operating officer, Jim, all of a sudden bursts into my office, red in the face, and he literally pounded my desk, and he demands to know why I always do that to this other leader on our team. And my jaw dropped open. I didn't know what he was talking about. I'm like, do what? What are you talking about? And he goes, you always cut him off. And I said, who? And he went on to explain one of our senior executives. And he said, every time this senior executive begins to answer a question from one of our investors, he gets about halfway through his answer, and I would cut him off. And a couple of things struck me. Number one, I was the boss, and here was my COO, looming over my desk, red in the face, just mad as he could be at me, and that was shocking to me. And this is a really smart man who has tremendous experience, who I had an enormous respect for, or I probably wouldn't have done this, but because of my respect for him and because of the extent of his anger, he got me thinking. And he went on to say that the senior executive was about to quit because I cut him off in these meetings. And my first thought was, why would anybody quit this company? We are kind of the envy of the industry. We just raised this growth capital. We're growing at double-digit top-line rates. We've all got equity incentives and have the chance to become wealthy people. Why would anyone leave that environment? And yet this key leader was about to walk out the door. And so that got me thinking. My COO, who was, pounding my desk, got me thinking. And initially, my thought was, well, I'm the CEO. These are my meetings to conduct. I set the agenda, and I can cut someone off if I want to. And that's all true. CEOs, you need to be the boss. You need to run the meetings, and a certain amount of that is appropriate. But you know what, Casey? I thought about it, and I thought about it, and several weeks later, it dawned on me that something else was going on. I needed to impress these new investors who had just invested $211 million. They were kind of a who's who of national names. And I realized that part of what I was doing was I needed to show off how smart I was. And I came to learn that I was using these board meetings as my own kind of personal pedestal to show off.
How many of you know an executive or leader like this? They have what Dudley calls the smartest person in the room syndrome. Leaders like this are a big reason why employees disengage from their work. Companies hire employees for their expertise, experience, and ideas, and yet some leaders turn around and either ignore, dismiss, or devalue what their employees say. Those leaders are more interested in their own image and worth. And it's that behavior that turns employees sour, drives a wedge between managers and their team, and ultimately causes employees to disengage and look for work elsewhere. Okay, now some of you may think that's okay. You'll fall to the "I'll just hire someone better" logic, or "they weren't an A player anyway." But that logic is flawed. The Society of Human Resource Management studied employee turnover and found that every time a salaried employee is replaced, it costs up to 9 months of their salary in recruiting and training expenses. And Josh Burson of Burson by Deloitte goes on to say that it may take a new employee 1 to 2 years to reach the same productivity as the existing employee. Now, of course, there are some exceptions, but this is the standard. Thankfully, Dudley did not want to go down that road, so he decided to do something that so few leaders are committed to doing.
I ended up adjusting my approach toward this other executive, and I stopped cutting him off. And this person is extremely smart, so I was never worried that what he would say would be wrong. I just sometimes got a little impatient with his style and that type of thing, and I just learned to accept it. And I got to the point where I started asking his opinion rather than cutting him off. I encouraged him to step forward and help us solve problems, both in board meetings and other executive meetings. And that individual went on to become one of our greatest contributors. And to this day, we're great friends. And he ended up working for the company the rest of his career until he retired and did very well for himself. And so, forgive me for the long-winded story, but the learning moment for me was I needed to get my ego out of the way, because I was unwittingly sending the wrong message. When you cut someone off like that, what they think is, "Oh no, the CEO doesn't trust me," or "the CEO thinks I'm wrong," or "the CEO is concerned with the direction I'm taking the organization." And in fact, it was the opposite. I had complete trust in this person. I had ultimate confidence in where he was taking our organization. I was simply communicating the wrong message by cutting him off. So, it wasn't like I was being dishonest. It wasn't like I was stealing from the company. I wasn't doing anything blatantly wrong. But the interplay between, what I needed from my own ego gratification versus what the organization needed, which was the commitment of this key executive, were in conflict. And when I learned to recognize that was a tremendous growth moment for me in my development as a leader. And there's many others, but I share that story to illustrate it. And I hope that sheds a little light onto the question you asked.
Absolutely. I think it's such a wonderful example on how a leader can change their approach and ultimately change employees' engagement. So considering all of the success that you had with Integra, again, you eventually left the company, you stepped down as CEO and decided to focus on leadership. Why is that?
Yeah, well, this is my current passion, and the reason I decided to write the book was twofold. One, I eventually did develop as a leader, and while I would say I'm still learning and I'm far from perfect, I certainly became more effective in my style as I learned than I was when I first started. And one of my motivating factors was every entrepreneur who really tries to do something significant eventually gets to the point where you realize you can't do it on your own. And you ask the question, how do I inspire others to fulfill the mission or to fulfill my vision as an entrepreneur? And, I went to a top business school and I never learned that in business school. And it was only through building a 2,000 employee organization that I ultimately began to learn how to answer that question of how do you inspire the following of others. And because it took me, 15 years to learn it, I thought, well, I'm going to write a book and hopefully shorten that period of time for other people. And then the second reason I wrote the book is, I attribute the success of Integra Telecom to its people and the leadership team that I was fortunate enough to be a part of. And when I look around at our commercial capitalist world, I see an annual statistic that just makes me depressed and angry. And that statistic is, it's published by the Gallup organization every year in a survey they do, where they report that some 70% of American workers are disengaged. And what that means to me is they don't like their job, they dread Monday morning, and they're really just showing up for a paycheck. And when I think about that, I get angry because what that means is that we as a culture, we as a society are dramatically underachieving. I mean, imagine what we could accomplish as a society if 7 out of 10 people were excited to come to work. Imagine the new forms of clean energy that could help address global warming. Imagine the new life-saving drugs that might be invented, or the solutions to global poverty that we're delaying, by this sad reality that 7 out of 10 people don't like their job. And what I found, and we weren't perfect, but in my experience, the reason we succeeded was we were able to build a culture of people that cared. We had an organization of people that didn't want to let each other down. And that's what allowed us to grow to be $600 million in revenue and be a leader in our industry, was that ability to create a culture where people did not want to let the organization down. They looked forward to coming to work. And the reason they did, we all made money and we all got career success. But the reason for that cultural, success we had was people cared. And they cared because they all believed in something bigger than themselves. And in our case, it was our mission and building this organization. I think it's natural for humans to want to attach themselves to a cause, to want to be part of something that's bigger than just yourself. And we weren't the most glamorous company in the world. We were not inventing life-saving drugs. We were providing data services to businesses, and yet we were able to create a culture where people wanted to show up on Monday morning, and people cared about the organization. And that's the reason I wrote the book, is that task, that job requirement, falls squarely on the doorstep of the leader. And I found that it's not easy. And I also found that many leaders don't necessarily think of that as their job. And so that's why I wrote the book, is I feel like we as a society can do better. I feel like I was fortunate enough to be part of an organization that tapped into the magic that can happen when people care about the mission and the cause. We don't live forever, so I wanted to share my learnings, and my hope is to start a national conversation and help others challenge themselves to think about the question, what can I do to make the culture in my organization more attractive to the people that work here?
It's important for leaders to take note on how their behavior affects employee engagement and the company culture. I want you to ask yourself these questions. How do you spend your time? Are you always with other executives or peers and not with your direct reports or frontline employees? Do you actively promote yourself and belittle others? Do you sit in a secluded office or make your receptionist act as a guard? Dudley makes a point that leaders' actions are visible to everyone, and those actions either show you are committed to the mission or only committed to yourself.
Whether you're manager or CEO, it's the leader providing evidence through their daily behavior that they're committed to the mission. People will engage around the mission. They will not engage around your own self-interests. And if you think about that as a leader, that's the first important step. And when you begin to build that kind of a culture, that's when great things happen. And that's when leaders create the ultimate success and the ultimate wealth, both in terms of the organization and their own personal results.
Well, that's some powerful advice for people to really take hold of. Thank you so much. Well, I really do appreciate you chatting with me today. And, I can't wait to pick up your book, Fusion Leadership, on September 12th. Thank you, Casey. It's been a lot of fun. All right, that was Dudley Slater, founder and former CEO of Integra Telecom and co-author of Fusion Leadership, Unleashing the Movement of Monday Morning Enthusiasts. You can pre-order the book by visiting the website fusionleadership.org. Now, don't forget to check out our website, themanilafolder.net. There you can get the show notes, links to the studies we talked about, and some other cool freebies. Lastly, if you like this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive rating. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm Casey Jorgensen, and this is the Manila Folder.